Yeah. All right. Well, we'll get started now. It's 7 p.m. I'm Jacob Hornberger. I'm president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, the sponsor of this conference called the National Security State and the Kennedy Assassination. Welcome back to our previous conference attendees, and welcome to anybody joining us for the first time. As most of you know, the Future of Freedom Foundation is a libertarian educational foundation, and our mission for over 30 years now has been to present the principled case for the free society. And part of that mission involves a focus on the national security state. We have long held that an essential prerequisite for achieving a libertarian society is a limited government republic. And I personally believe that the biggest mistake in American history was the conversion of the federal government to a national security state. And we'll be examining facets of that national security state in this conference. We already have, and we'll continue to do that. Now, before I introduce our speaker tonight, let me talk about a couple of things. Again, the old timers of this conference know the procedure. There will be a chat button where y'all can chat amongst yourselves. And then there's the Q&A button. If you want to ask a speaker a question or the speaker a question, then use the Q&A button, because I won't be looking at the chat button for questions. And again, please revolve your question around Jeff's talk tonight, or even the previous talk last week would be fine as well. Now, before I introduce Jeff again, let me tell you about what we're going to be doing next week. Now, next week, we move into the medical evidence portion of this conference, which is critically important. And the speaker who's going to be leading it off is Doug Horne, who served on the Assassination Records Review Board staff in the 1990s. And it wrote the watershed 5-volume book Inside the Assassination Records Review Board. Jeff has done a fantastic presentation. He's recorded the presentation. It's 2 hours and 40 minutes long. So obviously we felt that if we do that next Wednesday, if we present that to you, there's going to be no room for Q&A. But it's such a fantastic presentation that we didn't want to ask Doug to shorten it or do it. I mean, you'll see he spent so much time and effort putting this thing together that we wanted to present it to you in complete format. So what we're doing something different then, since we're doing these online Zoom meetings, we have some flexibility. We have already posted that video online. It's on our website at fff.org. You have homework. As part of being a registrant to this seminar, we're assigning you homework. There won't be any pop quizzes, but your homework is to watch this video before next Wednesday's presentation. And then next Wednesday's presentation is going to be devoted to Q&A. So that's your homework. Watch the video over the next 10 days or so. You can divide it up into segments, 1 hour segments or whatever. But please try to do that so that the questions will then revolve around the talk itself during the Q&A. Okay, we'll move to our speaker now, Jefferson Morley. I already introduced him last week. This is part 2 of his presentation, Morley versus CIA, my unfinished JFK investigation. Last week, he delivered a fascinating talk on revelations that he recognizes has happened in the last several years in the research community among in the Kennedy assassination. Let me reintroduce him. He is a former investigative reporter for the Washington Post. He worked there for about 15 years. He's been widely published in a number of publications, including The Intercept, the New York Review of Books, The Nation, The New Republic, Salon, Slate, Just Security, and others. He is the co-editor of a great website called deepstateblog.org. I go to it every day, as well as the founder and editor of jfkfacts.org, which is another great website about the assassination of President Kennedy. I go to that regularly as well. He's an author, the author of a book called The Ghost, which is a biography of James Jesus Angleton, the legendary CIA counterintelligence chief. Also the author of Our Man in Mexico, which is a biography of Win Scott, who was the CIA's chief spy in the 1960s in Mexico City. He's also the author of a book called Snowstorm in August. It tells the story of a riot in Washington, D.C. in the early 1800s. And we're pleased to say he's the author of 2 books that the Future of Freedom Foundation has published relating to the Kennedy assassination. One is CIA and JFK, the Secret Assassination Files. And the other is what he's going to be talking about tonight, Morley versus CIA, my unfinished JFK investigation. In fact, it's with this particular case that he's going to be talking about tonight that I discovered Jefferson Morley. I read a series of articles that he wrote about this particular case, and I was absolutely fascinated by it. And so I wrote a series of articles, like reviews of what he had uncovered, because I considered it so significant. And then he discovered that I'd written this series and contacted me, and we've been good friends ever since. And this is actually the second JFK conference that he has spoken at that FFF has sponsored. So without any further ado, let me present to you again, Jefferson Morley. Jeff, welcome back.
Thank you for having me, Jacob. Thanks for that nice introduction. So I don't know if everybody saw my presentation last week. It was more kind of looking backwards, looking at what have we learned in recent years, in the past 20 years, about the JFK story. And I ran through the things that had been, some of the things that had been most influential and struck me as both new and highly significant. And these range from the number of people, of political insiders like Jackie Kennedy and Bobby Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson, and foreign leaders like Fidel Castro and Charles de Gaulle, how many of them believed that the president had been killed by his enemies and rejected the official story, at least privately. That's a very significant finding. In the medical evidence, which you'll hear more from Doug Horn, I'm no expert in that, but the testimony of Dr. Robert McClellan, the doctor who tried to save Kennedy's life, and where he thought that the gunfire had come from. Very significant evidence for me. Doug Horn will also talk another piece of significant medical evidence, the testimony of Sandra Spencer, a photographic technician involved in developing the photographs of the president's autopsy, and what she said in her deposition to the Assassination Records Review Board. And then some of the better known revelations of recent years, the disclosure of a new Air Force One tape, the tape of communications with Air Force One on the afternoon of and evening of November 22nd, and what they showed. The disclosure of Operation North Woods, the Pentagon false flag operation to provoke a war with Cuba by staging a crime in the United States and blaming it on the Cuban government, something that was not disclosed to any JFK investigation. That's highly significant. And then finally, not one particular revelation, but a body of records, which is really the most complete and declassified version of the Lee Harvey Oswald file that we obtained in the final disclosures of the JFK Review Board. And we could see that the story that this man was, who allegedly killed the president, was unknown, essentially unknown to the US government, is really false and deliberately false. And we know now, and it's quite clear, it's really indisputable, Oswald was of interest to senior CIA operations officers on the eve of the assassination. And the CIA took care to conceal this from the investigations. And it was only in 2000 that we finally had some of these documents declassified in their entirety, and we could see all the CIA officers who were knowledgeable about Oswald before the assassination. So that's really the big body of records and the most important things that I came across. And then in my own personal efforts was one more thing, which was a kind of narrower point of view on the CIA's knowledge of Oswald. And that is that Oswald, in the last days of his life, was the target of a CIA propaganda operation, which was known by the code name of AMSPELL. And AMSPELL was the agency's code name for a group called the Directorio Revolucionario Estudiantil. In English, it was usually referred to as the Cuban Student Directorate. These were the students who were opposed to the Cuban government's turn towards communism after the revolution of 1959. Mostly from the University of Havana, not only. These were middle-class nationalistic students opposed to the left-wing government that Fidel Castro was imposing. And they were eventually forced out of Cuba by government repression and went to Miami, where they became funded by the CIA. And AMSPELL was the code name that the agency gave to them. So what we learned in recent years was that this entity, the CIA program, AMSPELL, was instrumental in publicizing Oswald's pro-Castro activities both before and after the assassination. This was not disclosed to the Warren Commission, for example. The Warren Commission, when they described Oswald's contacts with the Cuban Student Directorate in New Orleans in August of 1963, only said a Cuban exile organization. They didn't give the name of the organization because they wanted to hide, I believe, they wanted to hide the fact that it was the CIA that was funding this organization. And what we learned in the last 20 years was just how much they were funding this organization, $51,000 a month for these college students to run a big organization. To be sure, they had a lot of support in Miami and also around Latin America and around the country in cities like New Orleans and Dallas, for that matter. So they had a big organization, which was entirely supported by the CIA. And that's something new that we learned. But the part where I really got interested is when the first documents came out about this AMSPELL operation in the 1990s, I noticed that a lot of the communications were directed to and from a CIA case officer by the name of Howard. And so I asked around trying to figure out who was Howard, because if he was responsible for handling this group in 1963, which had repeated contact with Oswald in New Orleans in 1963, the Cuban students challenged Oswald for his pro-Castro politics. They got into a fight with him. They sent out a press release about him. They challenged him to a debate on the radio. They sent out a press release about that. They made a tape of the debate about the radio, all of which came in very handy 3 months later when the president was shot and killed and Oswald was arrested. At that point, the CIA's assets in the AMSPELL program had a world-class scoop on their hands. They knew all about the man who had allegedly killed the president. So I wanted to know, who was the CIA case officer running this operation? That would be a person who would know a lot about the assassination. And so I wanted to find out who that was. If they were still alive, interview them. If they weren't, figure out who they were and figure out, what they might have known. CIA officers are required to report quite diligently and thoroughly and are graded on the thoroughness and the diligence of their reporting. So if this man had sponsored a group that had contact with the man who killed the president, then that's something that he would, of course, be expected to report. To not report it would be an egregious breach of duty. So I went after this story, and it turned out to be kind of difficult to find out, who he was. So I turned to the JFK Review Board in 1997, and I asked them to ask the CIA, who was Howard? And so the review board did that. They put the question to the CIA, who was this group's case officer? And the answer came back from the CIA. We have no records of anyone named Howard. We think that it was just a routing indicator. That was the language that the explanation that the CIA gave to the JFK Review Board, that the name Howard that appeared on the documents didn't actually refer to a person. It was a routing indicator. Now, I don't know what a routing indicator is, but I had spoken to the guys in Miami who worked with him. They didn't know his real name, but they were young men then, and they dealt with him, and they described him to me. And a well-dressed man, Mediterranean features, kind of swarthy, very well-spoken, probably a lawyer, maybe from New York, very detailed description. So, and right down to his pinky ring. And so a routing indicator, I never met a routing indicator that had a pinky ring. And it turned out that that was a cover story. And the review board did their own investigations, and they found that Howard referred to a man named George Joanides. And the review board released a handful of records at the time of my inquiry, about 5-10 pages of records about Joanides. The review board didn't really have time to investigate anymore, and they didn't really know who he was, because it was only when we saw these records that we understood how important he was. He had a very sensitive job. He was the chief of covert action the chief of psychological warfare in the Miami station in 1963. And he reported directly to Deputy Director Richard Helms. This was clear from the fitness evaluations that we showed. But the information had one other thing that was really quite startling. And that was that not only had Joe Edis been involved or close in proximity to the JFK story in 1963, he had returned to the story in 1978. And this was the real revelation to me. 15 years later, this man, George Joanides, became the CIA liaison to the House Select Committee on Assassinations. That is, he's the point of contact. The committee's investigators would ask for records from the CIA. It was Joanides' job to go get them from agency files and turn them over, or to arrange interviews with retired CIA people. So he was the liaison. Well, the whole time that he was that liaison, the investigators for the House Select Committee on Assassinations were never told that he had been involved in the events of 1963, that he had been running the Cuban students who were the first to publicize Oswald's activities both before and after the assassination. So that really raised the stakes in the question of who this man was. I did some searching. Unfortunately, he had died. He had died in 1991. He'd never been questioned by any assassination investigators. So I eventually sued for his records. And that's the story that I tell in Morley v. CIA. I sued under the Freedom of Information Act in 2003 with the help of an excellent veteran Freedom of Information Act litigator here in Washington named Jim Lesar, who has represented lots of journalists and lots of JFK authors as well. And so we spent 16 years. I mean, I knew it was going to take a long time. I didn't think it was going to take 16 years, but what we did was sue for the records, and the CIA gave us a few records within a year and told us to go away. And so we appealed and said that the CIA had not complied with the law. And Jim Lesar's argument in that regard was very effective. And we won on appeal. And we won about 500 pages more of material that the CIA was forced to disclose. And it was here that we really began to understand more about the importance of Joe Edis' story. A couple of things. There were some travel records which showed that Joe Edis had a residence in New Orleans. He was stationed in Miami, and he and his family lived in Miami, but this paperwork showed that he had a residence, and it was on there. It said home residence, New Orleans. So Joe Edis, based in Miami, his agents have contact with Oswald in Miami, and it turns out he actually must have spent some time in Miami if he had a residence there. We didn't learn any more about it, but we did establish that he had a presence in Miami during his tenure as covert action chief in Miami. Given Oswald's presence in New Orleans, that was a very significant finding. Joe Edis, we learned also from these records that Joe Edis had been given a medal for his, at the end of his career, which praised him for, among other things, his performance in the domestic field. Well, the only time Joe Edis was in the domestic field was when he was in Miami. So he was being praised for this time. We also learned from those records that he had completely deceived the HSCA in their investigation. One of the questions that the HSCA had was, well, so who was the case officer for this group in 1963? It was the same question that I asked 20 years later. Who was in charge of this group? The HSC investigator, Dan Hardway, went to the CIA liaison, George Joe Edis, and asked for the records. Now, the answer to the question, Joe Edis had the answer to the question. He was the guy. But instead of answering the question, he said, I'll get back to you. And he never provided the information. So he stonewalled the House Select Committee on Assassinations in a very audacious way. And Bob Blakey, the general counsel for the HSCA, the man who ran the investigation, was furious when he discovered this, when I discovered that to him. And he really felt that he had been betrayed by the agency. And before that, Blakey had always said that the agency had cooperated with his investigation. And after the revelation of Joe Edis, he revoked that. And he said he no longer trusted the CIA and that they had compromised his investigation. They had not cooperated with it. So this was the story that we pursued through the federal courts. And I'm not gonna spoil the ending, but we stuck at it. And at the end of the day, we came to a final confrontation with the man who would become famous, Brett Kavanaugh. Brett Kavanaugh issued the decisive ruling in the case of Morley v. CIA. And his decision was very emblematic of how the national security state treats the Kennedy assassination. And in his decision, Kavanaugh said that the CIA deserves deference upon deference. That was a quotation that he cited. And that is the attitude of the national security agencies, the attitude of the courts about the national security agencies in the JFK story. Even on this story where public interest remains so high after many years, the courts still side with the secret agencies against the public interest. And that is really, what I learned the hard way. We learned some interesting and valuable information about the manipulation and monitoring of Oswald through the lawsuit. But we were stopped. We were able to identify records that we never saw about Joe Edis' actions in 1962 and 1963, about his cover, about his intelligence methods. And those records remain secret. So my book is kind of the prelude, the unfinished investigation. Where does the investigation go from here? Well, I think it goes to those records I didn't get. And we do know that those records exist, because when you do a Freedom of Information Act lawsuit, even if the government doesn't give you the records, they are still obliged under the law, under the act, to provide what's called a Vaughan index. And they need to identify the documents that they didn't give you. So you don't get to see the document, but you do know that it exists. And usually they'll give you a little bit of information about it, number of pages, type of document, that sort of thing. Well, I identified at the end of the day 44 documents that the CIA has on George Joe Edis that were generated in 1962 and 1963, or in 1978, 79, when he was the liaison to the HSCA, that are secret in their entirety. Now, why does this matter? Well, the last of the JFK records are up for review again this year. 4 years ago, the implementation of the JFK Records Act fell to President Trump. And after some hopeful signs, some of us hoped that he would do the right thing, he succumbed to the pressure of the CIA and allowed them to keep these records and thousands more, 15,000 plus records, secret for another 4 years. So later this year, Joe Biden's going to have to decide what to do about the last of the JFK records. And the records that I sought, I'm hoping will be in there, and I'm hoping the president will make do the right thing and release these records. There's no real reason to keep them secret anymore, except to spare the agency embarrassment. And that's not a reason that's good enough under the law. The law says all of these records should be made public. What's in those records? Well, this is a tough thing for me, because I don't know what's in the records, and I don't like to speculate because I could be wrong. And but given that the records are out of reach right now, what do they tell us? What do I think is in there? What's the unfinished part of my investigation? I think that what those records will show, what those 44 records will show, was that Oswald and the Fair Play for Cuba Committee were targeted in early 1963, probably as early as January 1963, for harassment, disruption. It was probably the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. When Oswald became involved in it, I don't know. But I think that the use of the AMSPELL program, which Joe Edis was in charge of, to create a negative public image for the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, I think that assignment originated in early 1963. And there's a whole bunch of documents about Joe Edis' cover. He might have been under cover of another agency, the Customs or Army Intelligence. He had worked under military cover in other assignments. So we don't know, but I think that that's where this assignment to target the Fair Play for Cuba Committee and Lee Oswald in August 1963, it takes shape then. And then Joe Edis, we know from the records we do have, becomes the chief of psychological warfare branch, covert action branch of the Miami station on August 1st, 1963. And Oswald's confrontation with the Cuban Student Directorate begin within a week. So, there may not be a connection there, but there may be. And the documents that I'm seeking, the unfinished part of my investigation, would be to clarify that. What was going on here? And maybe there is no connection. Maybe my speculation is wrong. If so, there will be nothing in the file that would be incriminating or to the CIA, and you would think that they would want to release it, given that the information is close to 60 years old. I don't think that's going to happen because I think the information is too embarrassing. But with the president reviewing JFK records this year, there's a shot. It's possible that we could get at these records. So that's a very narrow slice of what may happen this year. But that's the story of my lawsuit and what happens when you really try and get new information related to the Kennedy assassination. It's very difficult, and the courts make it very difficult. And I think my book is Morley versus CIA is interesting because you really see that process and you hear the judges talking, you hear the way the judges talk about JFK records in a way that is, quite different than the kind of media internet discourse, which is all about, conspiracy and all of that, and doesn't really interest me. What's interesting about my case is it's about how the government really worked in 1963 and about how it really works today. There's nothing theoretical about it. This is the national security state in action. So that's kind of the key background to the JFK assassination, and also why I think it matters this year. So I think I'm just going to leave it at that. I think that, that's my story. I urge you to get the book. It'll only cost you 99 cents. It's a good read. There's a lot of interesting characters in it, like the story of George Joanides, also how Brett Kavanaugh came to be involved in the case. And then also some cameos from longtime JFK investigators who really have had a kind of almost heroic role in my view. Jim Lesar, my lawyer, who we won multiple rounds in federal court with just one lawyer, Jim Lesar, and his co-counsel, Dan Alcorn. And we would go up against these teams of lawyers from the Justice Department. And it would be just us at our little table, and we'd look over the way, and at the government table, there'd be like 6 attorneys there. Some from CIA, some from Justice Department. These are all, they're all making 6-figure salaries. They all have nothing to do but, just this, you really felt the force in that courtroom. I really felt the force of the national security state. They were turning out the soldiers to make sure that, I didn't think that I was going to have any chance to prevail. So I saw the national security state kind of up close, its enforcement apparatus. And that was interesting to feel it in a kind of a visceral and personal way. So that's the story. I think that I'd like to, take questions, and maybe I can flesh out more what the story is and where I think the story is going. So let me pause there and let's talk about it.
Okay, great, Jeff. Let me start out with a couple questions from the host prerogative here. Yeah. So I'm curious as to when you went into court to make these arguments for the release of these records, what exactly was the argument of the CIA as to why they should not be forced to release these? And what was the reasoning of the court with respect to the release of these documents? That's my first question.
Okay, so one problem that we had is the records that were released by the JFK Review Board were released under the criteria, the standards of the JFK Records Act, which was passed in 1992 and was really a very strong law. It's much stronger than the Freedom of Information Act, but there's no grounds for action written into the JFK Records Act. So you have to sue under the Freedom of Information Act, which is a much weaker law and which has been amended at the behest of the agency to protect them even more. So, so the argument, we want to see the records of Joe Anita's operations in the summer of 1963. And we said, look, Congress says all these records should be made public. That's the intent of Congress. And they said, well, no, we don't care about that law. Under the Freedom of Information Act, we don't have to disclose operational records. So from the get-go, we never saw what was Joe Edis actually doing in his secret activities in the summer of and fall of 1963. So that was kind of ruled out from the start. Once we got in court, I mean, what they do is they throw every argument in the book at you. And so they have the right under the law to request exemptions under certain categories of information. So there's a national security category, which the courts never challenged. So with certain records we wanted to see, and they would say, you know, that's national security material, you can't see it. And so even in the documents that we did get, there are substantial redactions on those grounds. There's some privacy arguments, although Joe Edis has been dead since 30 years, but that was another argument that they used. Most perniciously, though, you know, they came back and they would argue things like this, and this is where you really feel kind of the viciousness of it, right? They would say, you know, Morley's just filing these records so that he can get the government to pay his copying costs. You know, Morley is out for commercial gain in this thing, and it was completely wrong. You know, we were doing this on our own dime. We were not going to make any money off of it. But you know, they impugn you. Not only do they deny you the information, but then they also impugn you in court. They impugn your motives to suggest that, you know, this isn't worth the court's time. So the arguments then get, you know, very technical about, well, can you release, you know, one exemption is about sort of organizational structure. And so they can withhold the name of, you know, a CIA office and so we got a lot of that as well. Fortunately, in that first round, when we won, the appellate court was very strong. And they said, you know, you have not complied with the law. And that was a key ruling, because we won a lot of additional material. For example, we got the first picture ever of Joe Edis receiving that medal. We got the story of his tenure at the HSCA. So we got a lot, but they constantly wore us down. And then what they said, one phase of the litigation was, typically if you win on appeal, right? If you prove that the government didn't comply with the law the first time around, typically, not always, the government will pay your court costs. It's kind of to encourage the government to obey the law, because if they don't, they'll have to pay out of pocket. The government fought us tooth and nail on that, because they didn't want to admit that we had found something significant in the files, which we clearly had. And we demonstrated that we had, because the New York Times covered the story, and Fox News covered the story, and AP covered the story. You know, it was a genuinely legitimate story. All major news organizations, you know, realized that. But the courts didn't do that. And I never forget, we were sitting in court and we had submitted a package of these press clips. And it was like 30 news stories around the country in major news sites, as an example of that there was public interest in here, and therefore, you know, the government should cover my court costs and pay for the fact that they were recalcitrant and didn't turn over the records the first time. And I know Brett Kavanaugh read those, because I saw him flipping through the package as he was listening to the arguments, you know, and he never mentions it in any of his rulings. So the attitude of the judges and of the lawyers is, you know, you really don't have the right to ask for this. And they were annoyed, and we even had a meeting one time with the CIA people, and you know, they were like, you know, giving me the dead eye. They were extremely hostile in person to factual questions about George Joe Edis. So, you know, they were bristling and ready to fight.
All right. Well, we got a lot of questions coming in, so I'm going to defer my second question to the end, and maybe somebody will cover it. Let me start with the questions. Charlie says, as you dealt with the CIA and the courts, did you get any sense as to where they stood personally regarding JFK? They shut you down, but did you see any emotional relationship with them with respect to JFK?
This is a good question. In that meeting that I just alluded to, face-to-face meeting, the first one that I had, I got the feeling that they were offended that anybody was asking for JFK-related records. There was zero interest in like, can we clarify the record? Can we fulfill the spirit of the Freedom of Information Act? No, it was, you're not going to get anything from us, and you're not even going to get like a handshake from us. That was the attitude.
Yeah, the standard arrogance of the national security establishment. They're in control, and we're the serfs or the peons.
Yeah.
If not for the Katzenbach, okay, this is from Joshua. If not for the Katzenbach memo, which stated that the U.S. government's position was that Oswald acted alone, do you think the CIA and the U.S. military would have asserted that Oswald acted on behalf of Cuba and or the Soviet Union?
I think they were waiting to see what happened. I mean, you see a concerted effort by CIA assets starting within hours of the assassination to lay the blame on Cuba. And that's the Cuban Student Directorate led that effort. And all of the stories in the American newspapers the next day were based on information that came from this CIA front group. So you see this initial effort. But when Johnson and Hoover, 2 days after the assassination, put out the word, as Hoover said, we have to find that Oswald was the real assassin, and we have to convince the public. And Katzenbach says the same thing. So White House and FBI get on the same page. At that point, the CIA assets abandoned an effort to blame the assassination on Cuba and quickly settle on this one guy did it alone for no reason. And so within 48 hours, the CIA leadership moves from a position of, oh, maybe we can blame this on Castro to, we're not going to investigate, Oswald's guilty, and leave us alone. And so I think that if Oswald had not been captured alive, there might have been a much more vigorous effort to blame the assassination. If the scheme or the plan of the people who assassinated the president was to blame the crime on Cuba, the fact that Oswald denied he was responsible was a big, problem. It was a huge problem. And so, the idea of blaming Cuba at that point kind of fell apart. And then when Oswald was killed, all bets were off because everybody said there must be some monkey business going on here. And I should say, I've said this before to you, Jacob, but I think I always emphasize this to the audience. National polling organizations did polls within a week of Kennedy's assassination, and they asked people, so the president was dead, Oswald was dead, what did people think had happened? And every poll that was taken that week showed about 2/3 of the people thought that more than Oswald was involved. So, and at that time, there were no JFK conspiracy theories. To the contrary, the White House, the FBI, the Dallas police were all saying, this one guy did it, pay no attention, we're sorry, it's over. And yet 2/3 of the people still believe there was a conspiracy. So the fear of conspiracy did not originate with conspiracy theorists. It originated in the facts of the crime.
Okay. Bob asks, Bob is asking a question that relates to the second question I was going to ask you. So I'll expand on it. He says, hi, Jeff, loved Our Man in Mexico, your book. Regarding Joe Edis, thoughts on how in both major investigations, the Warren Commission and the House Select Committee, the CIA had a gatekeeper in the liaison role, Dulles in the first case, and of course, Joe Edis. And my question is, can you go a little bit into what the misleading role that Joe Edis had as the liaison when he actually turned out to be a big obstructor with respect to Dan Hardway and Lopez on their investigation of the CIA?
Right. Well, I mean, as the liaison, he was in the position to cut off their lifeblood and to cut off to not answer any questions he didn't want to answer. And he clearly did not want to answer that question, who was the case officer for the Cuban Student Directorate? I think the only rational explanation for that stance is that he could not disclose the details of his operations that year in 1963 because they related to the assassination. I mean, they did relate to the assassination. It was his guys who were publicizing Oswald's pro-Castro politics. So that, to me, the fact that he never came forward indicates to me that he was witting to an operation targeting Oswald. And in 63, and then in 1978, he took the lead in making sure that the HSCA and Dan Hardway and Bob Blakey never learned that he was in Miami in 1963, much less the nature of his operations with the DRE AMSPELL group. So as the liaison, I mean, and this is what both Blakey and Hardway have said, he was really in a position to keep them from getting to anything that he didn't want them to see. And this story of what was going on with the Oswald AMSPELL contacts, seems to have been, Joe Edis was certainly acting like it was an authorized CIA operation.
Well, and I recall also that Judge Tunheim, who was the chairman of the Assassination Records Review Board, that he was upset when he learned of Joe Edis's role.
So
he said Joe Edis should have been a witness here.
The review board, when I said, who is Howard, see if you can find out, they went and the CIA didn't give them the answer, and they were able to do their own investigation, and they got the answer, and they put out about 10 pages of records. And then I was able to write about, so who was this guy and what was he doing? And when Tunheim read that, he was like, even when we answered the question, we really had no idea who he was. If the review board had gone out of existence by that time, so they couldn't go back. But he said, if we had been in existence, we would have gone back, gotten all of his records and declassified everything, because he was in such a central role, both in 63 and in 78.
Okay. Christopher says, in your opinion, how much has the CIA grown in influence in American governmental politics since the Kennedy assassination? If it has grown, why has it been so difficult to rein them in for subsequent presidents?
I think what the Kennedy assassination did was consolidate the CIA's position. I think that the CIA was very strong, and in some ways stronger in the 50s, because it had unquestioned public and congressional support. There was no opposition to the CIA in that regard, and its public image was, among the general public, was pretty good. People, were favorably disposed towards it. By not being held accountable for the Kennedy assassination, the CIA gained a tremendous degree of impunity, and we saw that impunity in the Watergate scandal years later. I mean, within 10 years, people began to realize how much secret power they had and how they had abused it. So the CIA's power, to answer Christopher's question, is it has grown since 1963. Its position in the American, national security state was solidified, and that was a close thing. There were a lot of doubts about the CIA's role in the assassination, most prominently from former President Harry Truman, the man who signed the CIA into existence. And as a result of the assassination, former President Truman wrote an editorial within a month, calling for the abolition of the clandestine service, the operational portion of the CIA. A remarkably bold statement, and clearly provoked by the Kennedy assassination. So Harry Truman, a man who knew how US government worked, a man who worried about creating the CIA in the first place. He worried about creating an American Gestapo, he said. That was a phrase he used. And after Kennedy's assassination, all of those doubts that he had were revived again. So nobody listened to Truman at that point, and the CIA continued to grow. The CIA's abuses of power were exposed in the 70s and somewhat curbed or brought into a little more government regulation. But the Kennedy assassination consolidated the power of the CIA and the American power scheme. And, I think that, to the point, why is it so hard for other presidents to undo? Well, that's impunity for you. And, that's why they still fight the release of these JFK records, because they feel that they can do it, and they don't want to talk about their past and have questions raised about it. So they are in a very strong position. And my book shows one other thing that's been added to their power, which is probably greater than in 1963, which is now they have the blessing of the courts. They have a lot of case law which says, the public, the Congress have to defer to these national security agencies in their business. So that also ensures their strength. And that's why, if presidents have the desire to, reduce their power, it's very difficult for them.
Well, it's reflected by their power of assassination. I mean, back in the 50s and 60s, they would keep their assassination secret and covert. Now they have a formalized policy of assassination, and the courts have said, we're not going to get involved in it, including if they assassinate an American citizen.
Yeah.
So that's pretty powerful.
Yeah.
Also, I think you mentioned Truman. That Truman wrote that op-ed in the Washington Post 30 days after the assassination. Okay. Yeah. That couldn't have been a coincidence, I don't think.
No, it wasn't. It wasn't.
Okay. Bob says, do you have a take on whether there was someone resembling Oswald deliberately impersonating him to create the Cuban-Soviet ties legend?
There's pretty strong evidence that somebody impersonated Oswald on the phone when he was in Mexico City. And there are multiple people who said that, including J. Edgar Hoover, after hearing a tape, said the man's voice on the tape was not the Oswald who was in custody in Dallas. So there was, yes, I think Oswald was impersonated. Whether he was impersonated in person, I don't think I think there's less evidence of that. There's talk of that, but I don't see any strong evidence. For being impersonated on the phone, the evidence is pretty strong that somebody faked a phone call in his name. And that's almost, prima facie evidence of an operation.
Okay, Charles has an interesting question. Do you know who Joe Anita's supervisor or manager was in the CIA?
Yes. Joe Edis was named to that position as the case officer by the Cuban Student Directorate by Deputy Director Richard Helms, who told the DRE leaders in November 1962 that he was going to give a new case officer who would report directly to him. And we have the transcript of Helms's conversation with the Cuban students in which he says that the new case officer will report directly to him. So he names Joe Edis. Now, one of the things that we saw in the lawsuit was his reporting. A case officer like Joe Edis handling a group like the Cuban Student Directorate has to file a monthly report called a monthly progress report. What's the group doing with the US government's money? Are they fulfilling the CIA's purposes or not? And so every month you write down how you spent the money and what you got for it, and should you do it next year, and is it all going to work out, and that sort of thing. So I saw the records, Joe Edis reporting on the Cuban Student Directorate. All of those reports could not be found or were denied to me. The CIA denies that they existed. The problem with their denial that they existed is that it was supported by a lie. They said the reason that there's no reports is because the CIA didn't have a relationship with the Cuban Student Directorate after April 1963. Well, that was a lie. And we know it's a lie because in 2017, they released more records from the AMSPELL file, and they showed that the CIA's relationship continued with the DRE up until 1966. So their denial that for the reason that there's no reports is because there was no relationship doesn't hold any water. There was a relationship, which raises the question again, well, where are the files? So I think what happened, to answer the question, is Joe Edis did not report in the normal way. The normal way would be for Joe Edis to report to the station chief, right? He runs a branch within the CIA's office in Miami, the branch responsible for psychological warfare. And normally he would report to the station chief, who would then report to headquarters. I think Joe Edis probably reported directly to headquarters. And we don't, it was probably somebody designated by Helms. So that alone tells you that it was an unusual and tightly held relationship. So, who was running Joe and Edis? I mean, it was somebody reporting to Dick Helms, and it might have been Helms himself.
All right, now, do we know when Joe Anita started working for the CIA and what his activities might have been before the DRE?
So one of the things that we obtained was in the lawsuit was a pretty full biography. He was a career CIA officer. He had joined in 1951 on a contract. He became a full-time undercover officer about in 1956 or 57 and worked in the Athens station. Joe Edis was born in the United States, but of Greek parents, spoke fluent French and Greek. So he worked in the Athens station, and he was transferred from the Athens station to Miami in the spring of 1962 at the behest of Helms, and probably at the behest of Helms's deputy, a man named Tom Karamessinas. And Tom Karamessinas was one of the senior Greek Americans in the CIA at the time. And he kind of had a generation of officers, of Greek American case officers who he brought into the agency. And I don't have direct evidence, but I'm pretty sure that Joe Edis was one of his kind of, promising, excellent case officers. And that's why they brought him to Miami, because they found him very trustworthy. So the chain of command is a little difficult to see. And one reason why I mentioned those records that I didn't get, I think they would shed light on exactly this question. Who was he reporting to? Because that is a key question. Joe Edis was no rogue operator. He was a very meticulous guy known for steady, loyal service. He would never have acted on his own. He was reporting to somebody and doing somebody's bidding. And who that person was, or persons, the people who targeted Oswald and the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, that's a key question, and we don't have the answer.
Okay, Charlie says, is there a regulation or law that states how long the JFK-related records must be kept, or is there a point in time when the shredding machines can move in?
Well, the JFK Records Act, passed in 1992, ordered all government agencies to identify any records that were assassination related. And they created an independent board, the Assassination Records Review Board, to go in and obtain these records and to review them and release them. So under the terms of the law, the review board did that and collected a huge body of records and made a lot of it public and did great work, as you'll hear from Doug Horn next week. They were, instrumental in bringing a lot of things to the fore. The terms of the law said that after 25 years, all of the assassination-related records that had been collected and reviewed should be made public in their entirety. So that was the sunset of the law. No records in the JFK collection can be destroyed, period. So we have that collection of records now. It's still not complete. It's still not completely open. There's 15,000 records still missing, and there's key records like the Joe and Edis files that are still withheld. But that's the body of records we're working with. There's also a law that says that government records have to be made public after 50 years, but the CIA has an exception to that, and they use that loophole to deny even things that are more than a half century old. So, I hear a lot of arguments when I talk about these records, and there's two arguments that I hear. And one is, there's nothing in there. The government destroyed everything a long time ago. And the argument is, there's nothing in there. We know one man alone and unaided killed the president for no reason, and so there's nothing relevant left to say. So, I hear those two arguments a lot. And I just think if either of them were actually true, we would not be in the situation we're in. So if it were true that the government destroyed everything a long time ago and, there's no use in looking, well, we learned a tremendous amount from the JFK Review Board. There was a lot that the government never shredded that reflects very poorly and undermines the official story at every turn. So it wasn't true that the CIA shredded everything a long time ago. Historically, that has not been true. Every round of disclosure has resulted in important information coming out. Now, there may be less now than there was before. we're dealing with a much smaller group of records. But I don't accept the argument that, oh, it was all shredded a long time ago, nor do I accept the argument that there's nothing in there because we know that one man alone and unaided killed the president for no reason. Every round of disclosure has undermined that argument. So I don't find either of those arguments valid in terms of the JFK records. I think there's still records out there that are important and we need to get our hands on. That's not to say that key records haven't been destroyed. We know that that has happened also, but that was an illicit process. I'm talking about the legal process where the records are supposed to come out.
Well, I know that if I had done something wrong, Jeff, and there were tons of records that were pointing in that direction, the ones I would want to keep hidden to the very last would be the most incriminating ones.
I mean, as a journalist, I mean, that has to be your working supposition. I mean, why are they keeping it secret? I mean, they're not keeping secrets for no reason. I mean, the CIA does keep secrets instinctively. And if we look at this body of records that is still secret, we can see things that are ridiculous. Like I came across one today in a document about Bill Harvey in 1963. It says chief of station, comma, and it's blanked out, okay? We know what's under that redaction, Rome. It's been on the public record for years. The CIA has, in other contexts, had no objection to the publication of that information. So they just do that to prove that they can prevail and make you fight them and take up your time, with a ridiculous overclassification. A lot of what's going on is ridiculous overclassification, but that's not to say that there's not a kernel of important information in that haystack of trivial information.
Right. Okay. Jay asked, is there any indication that Joe and Edis ran Oswald in New Orleans?
Good question. Good question. Is there any evidence? No. I mean, we know he had a residence there. And, I think it's possible that he might have been the person to have contact with Oswald. But, that would be purely speculative. And I have to say, there's no evidence. There is evidence that we know he was running the AMSPELL operation in 1963. We know he went to New Orleans in 1963. And we know Oswald was in New Orleans having contact with the AMSPELL assets in 1963. That's about as tight as you can draw the circle. You can't really say anything definitive about that. I would just say it's possible. And the fact that, as I said before, that they're hiding lots of information about Joe and Edis' cover and intelligence methods in 1963 is another thing that makes me think your speculation might be right, because those things are still very sensitive 58 years later.
Okay, well, I'm having a glitch with my Zoom program because I keep starting my video and it keeps shutting down. So as long as people can hear me, that's okay. But you won't be able to see me. Okay, Michael asks, when did the DRE first fall out with Castro?
So Castro came to power on January 1st, 1959. And in 1959, Castro's coming to power was not a brutal takeover by any means. He came to power universally acclaimed by tossing out an unpopular and corrupt dictator. So in 1959, the Cuban Revolution Cuba was in a state of flux and contact, and Castro was cleverly playing for time. But in 1959 and 1960, the fallout begins. And really the turning point is in February 1960, Anastas Mikoyan, a Soviet diplomat, not their foreign minister, but kind of a deputy foreign minister, came to Havana. And this was a sign that Castro was turning to the Soviet Union for help and protection from the United States. And the leaders of what became the Cuban Student Directorate, that's when they mounted a protest. And they had a protest in the Parque Central in Havana to protest Mikoyan's visit. They were anti-communist students. And they were attacked by a mob of Castro supporters, and it was kind of a big brawl, almost a riot in the Parque Central. And those students were then expelled from the University of Havana, and that's when they came to Miami. So it was in the summer of 1960 where those students opposed to Castro felt they had to leave the country. They came to Miami, and when they got there, because they were young and enthusiastic and well organized and determined to take on Castro, the CIA started funding them. So that was August 1960 was when the funding relationship began. And we now know that it continued through 1966.
Okay. Jim asks, some people, of course, suggest that Oswald was involved in the Fair Play for Cuba Committee as an agent provocateur connected to Guy Bannister, the retired FBI agent there in the intelligence area in New Orleans. And Jim's asking, are you implying that Oswald was a genuine communist? And then he follows it up with, what about Oswald's slip in his radio debate when he said that while in Moscow, he was under the protection of the US government, and then quickly stopped and corrected himself?
I think that this, the Oswald AMSPELL contacts, there's two possibilities. One, they were coincidental. The other possibility is that somebody wanted that to happen. And I think given that this is CIA activity, I think somebody wanted it to happen. And that somebody was whoever George Joannides was reporting to. So we don't know where the chain of command goes. We know it goes up from Joannides towards headquarters. In terms of what's going on in Dallas, I think that, yeah, Oswald is acting like a provocateur. The CIA and FBI had the Fair Play for Cuba Committee well penetrated. The executive director was a CIA informant, for example. The accountant was an FBI informant. So they were in a position to act in the name of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. And that's a classic COINTELPRO tactic, is you take over an organization and you act in its name and you do embarrassing things, and there's nothing they can do, to protect themselves because you have assumed their identity. And that seems to have been what happened in 1963, in August 1963. Now, there's no contradiction. Was Oswald a genuine leftist? He talked leftist politics to a lot of people. That doesn't mean that his approach to the Fair Play for Cuba Committee was based on sincere leftism. I think it was based on an idea of intrigue. And Oswald was an adventurer, well-traveled, spoke Russian, and liked to do things and make things happen. So I think that the agency exploited his genuine leftism, for its own ends, which was to embarrass and destroy the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. And that, in fact, is what happened. A month after the assassination, the Fair Play for Cuba Committee disbanded. A group that had 40 chapters on US college campuses disbanded because of the taint of Oswald on its name. So that was, and I think that this is why Joannides' medal is important. I think Joannides got a medal for helping destroy the Fair Play for Cuba Committee.
Well, and then there's that unusual incident where Oswald's out there handing out pamphlets in favor of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee with the return address, which is the side entrance to Guy Bannister's office.
Yeah, no, and so
that's new.
Yeah, and the question is good because it does go back. Oswald was seen in that building. He was seen in the presence of Guy Bannister, and this was known to federal agents in New Orleans. And when the Church Committee investigated the assassination, this is some documents that have emerged in recent years. There were a couple of guys from the Immigration Naturalization Service who worked in that area downtown Dallas, and they said, yeah, we had been keeping an eye on that group of Bannister and Ferry, and Oswald was one of them. That's what the guy from INS said, and he said, I've been waiting for years to talk about this, and the Church Committee never followed up. They never interviewed that guy. At least we have no record that they ever interviewed him.
Okay, James asks, before your discovery of George Joannides, it was assumed and written that David Phillips, CIA agent officer, controlled the DRE. Did Phillips and Joannides work together on controlling the DRE?
it worked like this. David Phillips was stationed in Havana in the mid 1956, 1957. He got another assignment, went overseas. He came back. They put him back into Cuba in 1960. When the Cuban students protested the Mikoyan visit, that's when Phillips recruited them. And when they came to Miami, he gave them money, and he gave them a case officer, a man named Ross Crozier. And so Ross Crozier handled the group for Phillips. And then in November 1962, Helms intervened. They replaced Crozier with Joe Edis. So Phillips was always kind of the godfather of the DRE, but he always had a case officer who would be handling them on a regular basis. Phillips had a lot larger responsibilities by 1963. He was running operations against Cuba out of Mexico City, and he was running, according to Wynn Scott, the station chief, probably a dozen different operations. So the DRE would have only been one of those in which he was handling. But Phillips' responsibility for the DRE is pretty clear. When Howard Hunt was interviewed by the HSCA and was asked, who was running the DRE, he said, that was Dave Phillips, but I believe that's classified. So Dave Phillips's role in the DRE was also sensitive. Joe Edis would have been junior to somebody like Phillips. So Phillips surely knew Joe Edis at the time he was handling the DRE. There can't be any doubt about that, but we have no record of it, which is interesting.
All right, Carlos just makes a comment. It doesn't ask a question, but I'll read the comment in case you want to comment on it. I'll first comment though. Many Cuban Americans in Miami, Florida have rejected the story that Castro had absolutely anything to do with the Kennedy assassination, even though the story has been heavily pushed among us. We believe that Castro both lacked the resources to be involved and had too much to lose had he been linked to the assassination. Well, let me just first say that when we move into the medical evidence, starting with Doug Horn's presentation next week and followed by 3 more presentations by physicians, it will be easy to see that there is no possibility whatsoever that either Castro or the Soviets had anything to do with this assassination due to the fraudulent nature of the autopsy. Do you want to comment on that, or should we?
Yeah, no, I mean, the DRE published the first JFK conspiracy theory to appear anywhere in public print, and they were funded by the CIA. And it was a headline in their newspaper, side-by-side pictures of Oswald and Castro. And the headline was "The Presumed Assassins." This was published within 48 hours of Kennedy's death at CIA expense. So that story has been there from the beginning. It's been pushed very heavily. There's not much evidence to support it. I mean, Oswald did have contact with people in Mexico City who would be presumed Cuban intelligence agents. But if you look at the whole history of contacts with intelligence agencies, Oswald had 100 times more contact with CIA assets than he had with Cuban government assets. It's not even close. So the argument that Castro was behind it, it's really more of a rhetorical thing, because the other thing that when you drill down on the investigations, the US government professed to hate Castro. They wanted to kill him. They wanted to overthrow his government. The CIA assets were putting out the story that, Kennedy had been killed by a Castroite. And yet the CIA never investigated the possibility. They never investigated the possibility that Oswald worked with Castro. So it seems like while their public assets were generating that story, privately, they never took it seriously. If they had, they would have investigated, and they never investigated. It's one of the striking things about the investigation that came out in the 1970s. And the CIA people were asked that repeatedly. Well, you were trying to kill him. Kennedy gets killed. Why didn't you investigate him? And the answer was, we don't know. I mean, it's pure bluff. It's not credible. And like Carlos says, people have pushed this story awfully hard, and it still gets pushed in the media sometimes, and it's just not credible. The evidence isn't there to support it.
Yeah, that's a fascinating observation, Jeff. Okay, Mike says, wasn't Helms the CIA liaison to the Warren Commission? Didn't he personally appoint Joe Anita as the DRE case officer? So can we assume he lied about what he knew as well to the Warren Commission?
He was not the liaison to the Warren Commission. Helms was a very smooth operator, and he never put himself in an awkward or vulnerable position. Certainly not when he was the deputy director. Helms did, control and obstruct the Warren Commission investigation from his role. The day-to-day business of, excuse me, the day-to-day business of dealing with the assassinate of the Warren Commission fell to junior staffers.
Okay. Charlie asks, have all of your Freedom of Information requests been directed to the CIA, or have some been directed to the Pentagon? And if not to the Pentagon, why is that?
Over the years, I have come to have a greater appreciation of the Pentagon's role in these events. I have not done Freedom of Information Act with them because I didn't have a solid lead. I mean, I should. The point is well taken. The question that I have and that I should pursue in FOIA is, did Joe and Edis have military cover in 1963, which strikes me as a definite possibility. But I'm sorry to say I have not investigated that. Maybe I will.
Okay, let me skip a few here. Where may we find Kavanaugh's opinion in your case?
It's reprinted in Morley v. CIA. It's the appendix of Morley v. CIA, along with a dissent from Judge Karen Henderson, another senior U.S. appellate court judge here in the D.C. circuit, who strongly defended my case and I think really eviscerated Kavanaugh's arguments. So Judge Henderson's dissent in the case was great moral victory for me. It showed that an eminent, distinguished, experienced judge saw the merit of my case. And read it side by side with Kavanaugh. It's a good read.
Okay, Dan says, I'd like to mention that one of the efforts the Truth and Reconciliation Committee is making is to ensure that the JFK, HSCA, and Church Committee records get released. Jeff mentioned that he'd clarify that the TRC is still alive. The website is americantruthnow.org. We're working on other initiatives.
Yeah, so the Truth and Reconciliation Committee is an effort, a group that wants to reopen all of the assassination investigations from the 1960s. JFK, RFK, Martin Luther King, and Malcolm X. So that's an ambitious agenda. And they're, yeah, like Dan says, American Truth Now is their URL. You can find out more about them there.
Okay. Carl says, skip that. Skip that. Sorensen says that. Helms and McCone testified to, Lawrence says, Helms and McCone testified to the Warren Commission. They were deposed by Dulles about matters that happened during Dulles's term. That's not a question, it's just a comment.
Well, not a question, but it's a good point. Helms and McCone were brought in, and Dulles, who had a huge conflict of interest since the assassination efforts had originated on his tenure as director, leads the questioning. And the gist of his questioning was, you didn't know anything about this fellow Oswald because the State Department didn't inform you, isn't that right? And Helms basically says, yeah, I don't recall. Helms couldn't recall documents that he had read 7 weeks earlier. That's how important the assassination of the president was to him. He forgot about the Oswald file within 7 weeks. So the testimony was wholly misleading because we now know that the State Department did inform the CIA about Oswald, and about 25 different cables went from the State Department to the CIA between 1959 and 1963, detailing exactly Oswald's dealings with the State Department. So the CIA's cover story that they didn't know much about Oswald before the assassination was just fictional. But that session where Dulles, does leading questioning for Helms and McCone, that was the first, big piece of the cover up, because that's when the Oswald file kind of vanished from view, and nobody ever, the Warren Commission certainly never understood the CIA's interest in Oswald before the assassination.
Okay, well, Brent gives us a suggestion that will be a wrap up. He says, why don't you give Jeff a couple of minutes for water? And so we're going to give you more than 2 minutes. I'm going to wrap it up now. Jeff, thanks. This has been a great presentation, a two-for presentation last week and this week. Just fantastic. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me. I would say to anybody who wants to be in touch, you can direct message me on Twitter at Jefferson Morley, or you can email me at the website editor@jfkfacts.org.
Yeah, and you can get both of his FFF books, CIA and JFK, The Secret Assassination Files, and most recently, Morley versus JFK, My Unfinished JFK Investigation, Morley versus CIA, on our website or at Amazon. You can get both of the books at Amazon. You can get all of the other 3 books at Amazon. And I would invite you to visit regularly at jfkfacts.org and deepstateblog.org. And Jeff, thanks again. It's been great.
Thanks for having me. Good night.
And now let me remind everybody that next week, okay, we got Doug Horn. We now move into the medical evidence. We're going to have 4 presentations. We've added 3 more physicians, independent physicians. You've got Dr. Michael Chesser. You've got David Mantic. You've got Gary Aguilar that are going to follow Doug Horn. I am very confident that if you all will go through these 4 speakers, you will reach the same conclusion that I and many other people have reached. And the evidence, not a theory, that the evidence inexorably leads to but one conclusion, that this was a fraudulent autopsy. And then you got to ask yourself, is there any innocent explanation for a fraudulent autopsy? Again, Horn's video is on our website. Somebody asked where they could find it. It's just go to fff.org and you'll find it there in the multimedia section. It's 2 hours and 40 minutes or so long. It's an excellent presentation. If you watch it before, instead of just showing up next Wednesday, you'll get a lot more out of the Q&A. And equally important, you'll get a lot more out of the next 3 physicians that will be talking about the medical evidence. Horn sort of sets the foundation for the next 3 talks. So with that, we'll sign off. And Jeff, thanks again. And we'll look forward to working with you in the future.
Thank you.